Superhero comics have been a staple of the world since the early 20th century, with the first story being Superman in Action Comics #1 all the way back in 1938. They were heavily reflective of the times. Publishers used them as wartime propaganda to radicalize the masses and help to push the war effort against the Axis powers in World War II, with characters namely being, Captain America and just DC's Trinity in general, i.e., Superman. He does kind of wear the American flag a little bit, more so Wonder Woman with, her underwear literally being the Star Spangled Banner, and then the One Piece, essentially, not the anime. But as time has progressed, comics have still kept this idea of being a reflection of the current times. In my opinion, however, due to the status quo that is enforced upon these comics by the companies to keep the characters as close to what they deem as their core traits, they have prevented them from truly evolving to be a representation of today's society. With this video, I hope to not only address this problem, but also prove why allowing characters, namely, Peter Parker, which I have made a video on that in its entirety, so we're not going to talk about him right here. I'll link that in the description below. Great video, you should check it out. Or Bruce Wayne, who will be discussing them. He's going to be the main focus of this video, to pass their mantle on to different characters, and how this would not only help to improve their characters, but also overall allow for better stories in general. So with all that set up out the way, let's get it done.
I'm Batman, the world's greatest hero for a new generation, the Batman.
So first, to start off this video, we obviously have to acknowledge the problem, which is that I think a lot of comic book readers will agree with me on this, is that these companies just have a large aversion to the idea of change. But to acknowledge this problem, we also have to address us as comic book readers and our own aversion to changes in a lot of comics, because companies have tried to do things differently in the past to varying degrees of success and to varying degrees of quality, right? At times, there is a very vocal section of the comic book community who are so attached to certain characters and would love it if honestly they just stayed stagnant throughout their entire run, their entire stories. And this is important because at the end of the day, it's our wallets that do the talking to these companies. It's not about art really anymore, except for to the artists or the storytellers. It's not about the art and the storytelling to them, their shareholders. It's what sells the best. Now let's get into how this problem can be fixed. So imagine if every generation or so we had our own version of a Batman or a Batwoman, right? The one thing people have complained about for years with these characters specifically is the idea of the rolling timeline, right? With Bruce Wayne, it makes no real sense that he has 4 different Robins in the New 52 when they condensed the entirety of DC history into 5 years, which would mean that Dick Grayson would have been Robin at the age of 13. And this is considering if Bruce became Batman. Bruce was Batman at the beginning of that 5 years, and Dick became Robin at the beginning of that 5 years. Like, that has to happen concrete, which isn't what happened. Like, Dick didn't start becoming Bruce's Robin until I think probably 3 years in. I'm not 100% concrete on that, but this would mean that he became Robin at the age of 13 instead of 8 to 10, which honestly I think is a little bit better. He's still a child soldier. But this would also mean that within that time, Jason died and became Red Hood, Tim became Robin, then Red Robin, and also Damian became Robin, which is just one that makes the least sense to me because Bruce was supposed to be Batman when Damian was born. This was all in the effort to keep Bruce in his early to mid 30s, but have all the history he's had over the course of the past 20 years. All this to say that the rolling timeline expects you to suspend your belief, which I get, it's a superhero comic. I can believe that an alien man can fly, a rich billionaire orphan is jumping off of buildings, and a woman with bangles and bracelets can deflect bullets and she's made of clay. But do not tell me that Bruce Wayne went through 4 Robins in the span of 5 years and honestly expect me to believe it, especially because Damian's supposed to be, I think, 10 or 13. That just doesn't make sense to me, right? And to this, I propose the idea that from the very beginning, which would have been all the way back in 1938 or whenever, those characters were introduced, we give them their own life cycles, right? We allow every generation to have their own versions of characters. Instead of having some big event and rebooting, like essentially now every 5 to 7 years, which back then, I think a crisis happened like every 10-20 years, something like that, but now it's just tired and played out. Think with Wally West, but we do that with almost every single hero, and also allow the death to stick. Wally became the definitive version of the Flash for an entire generation before Barry came back in 2008, and I think Barry died in, I can't remember which Crisis it was. When, I don't remember when Final Crisis was. I think it was Crisis on Infinite Earths. Yeah, it was Crisis on Infinite Earths. Crisis on Infinite Earths. Sorry. All the way back in 19 whatever year it was, right? And for the most part, imagine if Dick, or honestly any of the other 4 Robins, were properly given the chance to have their own take on Batman, instead of every few years saying that this is what this would look like as Batman. It's cool, but it gets old. Like right now we're doing that with what's the current event with the Dark Side thing? Oh my god, DCKO. Yeah, like Batman, like he has like Batman Nightfall, like really dope story, really love the art, it's so interesting. But I'm kind of getting tired of every couple years, it's like, yeah, this is what, you know, this Robin would look like as Batman, this is what that Robin would look like as Batman, and then we go back to the main timeline and you're just like, all right, well, this is why this Robin shouldn't be Batman, this is why Nightwing shouldn't be Batman, this is why Jason shouldn't be Batman. It's just like, pick one and stick with it, right? The biggest thing this would do for the story is the idea that deaths have meaning. If a large-scale event were to take place, we have the added weight of our version of Batman, or just any hero within that continuity that we've grown up with. That's the most important thing. We've actually grown up with this specific version of that character. We can see them die, and that means something, and actually be replaced by a successor, right? Again, like exactly what happened with Barry, it gives authors the freedom to have different things to define their version of that character. You can have a concrete no-kill rule for Batman, but what if a Batman went, you know, through something that causes him to start to ignore this no-kill rule, right? Then somebody else, maybe one of his subordinates or something, like somebody who was a Robin or was a Batgirl or a spoiler or something, feels the need to step up and take the mantle away from him, right? That would be so cool, because it shows that there's ramification and there's character development that actually sticks. That's the most important part about this. Character development actually sticks, because I'm tired of Peter Parker running through the same couple stories over the course of 10 years. I'm so tired of it. And another product of this idea could be the idea of introducing new heroes, right? To perfectly encompass this idea, think about JoJo's Bizarre Adventure, right? Each part has its own vibe and iconic stories, and it's known for its own thing. I think that is how comics should be handled, you know? And before I do end off this video, I do want to move on to what I think is the most crucial part, and it's how this would affect the world in terms of world building and how it should happen.
Bring on the Batman.
So what I think is the most important part about allowing characters to age in comics is seeing how it reflects upon the world in which they live. Do I think the world at large needs to know that superheroes are passing on their mantle? No, not really. You know, Batman can still be viewed as this local legend, you know, this boogeyman that isn't a man, like he's just a creature out there. It helps to drive that idea, and I think that would even further cement the idea of Batman, you know, that he's just this otherworldly thing striking fear into the hearts of criminals. And I know Batman is more than just a fearful character, you know, he's caring, he's compassionate, especially towards children and things like that. But just for that aspect of him, I think that's perfect. But for characters like the Flash, I think it's okay to let the world at large know, right? Because he serves a very different purpose within the context of the world. So they can be selective with how and who they allow to be known as a dynasty, because, you know, there's the Flash family. I guess there's a Bat family, but the Flash family, they've all been the Flash at one point or another. So that is what I consider a true dynasty. So I don't really care, especially who they, you know, decide on things like that. So when I say reflect on how it affects the world, I mean with characters like Superman or Wonder Woman, because these are characters that are famously either Wonder Woman is 100% confirmed immortal, or Superman, they've toyed with the idea of Superman being essentially immortal a lot, right? Because that is one of the most interesting aspects of this. We finally get to see Superman still being that hopeful beacon of light that we have come to know him as throughout the years, even though he may have lost his best friend, maybe even the woman he loves, right? This itself could be a story beat. Does Superman want to continue to lead humanity into the future if the people that he's grown and loved are gone. Yeah, you know, he struggles with the fact that he continues to lose people around him that he loves. So he could maybe give up his powers to age because he found a successor either in Connor or, you know, his son, John, which I don't know what John's title really is right now. He was Superman for a little bit, and then Clark came back to Earth. I think John is still Superman. I don't know. Aging him up was just a bad idea to me. They should just let him stay 13 and be friends with Damian. I loved the Super Sons. That was cool. And another idea would be following the same idea as Battle for the Cowl. Battle for the Cowl? Yeah, Battle for the Cowl. Wow, I struggle to say that. But of course, this would actually have ramifications for everyone at large and everyone involved. I mean, we could even do a voting system like what they did with Jason. You can vote for who you want to take on the mantle of a certain hero. That would be honestly just the coolest thing. This would not only have people interact with the story themselves, but also help to give the idea that, yeah, this is who you wanted to be your next Flash, which could very much be reflective of the times. You know, maybe a certain character has certain traits that you want to see more in the media. You can vote them in, and it can be an encapsulation of the time, right? Certain people may take on the role of a hero, but maybe along the way they turn into villains, you know, again, like how with Hal Jordan, like what he did. And another thing that could be done, and that would honestly hold more weight, is time travel stories. Maybe if a certain writer wants to do something along the way where they reintroduce a certain version of a character to add to their lore, it would make for a very interesting way to do this. Of course, there would be limitations with this. You know, these certain rules you have to follow when it comes to those older versions of the characters. I do think each person who picks up the mantle needs to have a mix of their own definitive character traits mixed in with certain hard traits about the mantle. I will acknowledge that. Again, this can be allowed to be bent as long as the author actually has something to say with it. But this is the most important aspect of this. Allowing growth like this allows the authors to say something with these characters, and it prevents them from being so stagnant and just stale with them. Looking at you, 616 Peter Parker, they're kind of making him better now, right? A little bit. Making it more interesting. There's no reason that Batman and Catwoman essentially are just still doing this will they won't they story when we literally had an entire arc about them getting married just for them to not get married. I'm tired of it, bro. Like, it's sickening. It gets tiring seeing every couple of years or so they have to reset the entire universe, but somehow everything is still the same. You know, whenever a crisis would happen in DC, it meant something in those earlier years, right? Now they happen every 5 to 10 years or so. And don't get me wrong, the stories are cool, but they're just used to sell comics even more than they did back in the day. I know back then they did those big crisis events to either consolidate stuff or just sell more comics. I get it, but it's tiring. You know, you can't just bust out a crisis event every freaking 4 to 5 years. Like, what was it? It was Dark Knights. No, it was Dark Crisis. Yeah, because Dark Knight's death metal led into Dark Crisis, and then now we're having DCKO, which is essentially going to be like a reboot reset of the universe. I don't know, bro. It's just time. Like, in the past, what, 20 years, 26 years, we've had like what, 3 or 4 crises, versus like in the 19 somethings it was like really just 2 or 3, and that was spread out across the course of a couple years, right? Now it's just like whenever sales are low, or whenever they feel like they've messed up really bad, like they did with DC's New 52, like, you know, they did Rebirth after, and then of course they've already incorporated crises into the actual story, you know, crisis energy and stuff like that, and it's cool. But dude, just I don't know, man. It comics, this is why I prefer manga. I'm kind of going on a rant right now, but this is why I do prefer manga, because it's a linear story. Characters grow, characters die, characters may come back, but I think American comic books would benefit so much more from just having these characters actually grow with us, and just being a better representation of society. There's only so many ways and so many times you can be like, oh yeah, you know, Batman, the billionaire philanthropist, blah blah blah. And that's why honestly I just enjoy Elseworld stories so much. I think that's why DC's Absolute comics are doing so fantastic, and Marvel's other stuff, the Ultimate stuff, was doing good. Not so much anymore. Not as good as Absolute, but that's why Absolute is so good. It's like a new, fresh take on these characters, right? And they are in our modern day, right? They're literally ingrained in our modern. They're not painted onto our modern day. They're ingrained into the modern day, right? And that's why I think Absolute Comics and Absolute Batman, Absolute Superman, Absolute Wonder Woman, that's why I think they do Absolute Martian Manhunter, that's why I think they do so phenomenal, is because these stories are taking established characters, right? Sure, it's the same names that's being used, but they're different, right? They're trying to get to who we know them as, but in a different way, right? With Absolute Batman, for example, you know, Bane, Joker's new origin, just Absolute Batman hasn't missed, right? And I think mainline DC can be that if they allow the authors to be more free with these characters. But of course, I'm not a writer, you know, I just see a vision with these characters, and having them experience actual ramifications would do so much for them, just like how they, again, do in manga. Of course, there could still be some minor retcons, but I think those should be relegated to the current version of the character. You can't really go back and do major retcons with Bruce's story if Damian's grandson is Batman. You know, I think that kind of just messes up things. You can add on to the lore, but not in a way that really messes up what's already established. But, you know, that's the video. And, you know, I'm sure you guys have a lot of opinions because this is a comic book video. Comic book people have a lot of opinions. So let me know down below and, you know, leave a like, a comment, and I love you guys. I will see you next time. Goodbye. We're trying to hit 1,000 subs by the end of the goddamn month. I'll see ya.